Hello, good morning. I am live. I'm on to a new book, Life as Carola. It is another of Joan Grant's far memory novels or books. It was her second book I read here, and it plays in Italy. The young girl in this story, Carola, was born on the 4th of May, 1510, and we are now in the second chapter. It's chapters and then there's stories within the chapter. So we're at chapter 2 now, and she talked about her father, Orlando. Anyhow, she is now about 6 years old, I think, and the chapter is entitled The Tear in the Tapestry. Orlando never came to our turret, and I only saw him in the distance, walking on the smooth lawns or on the terraces where white statues gleamed in the formal arbours of glossy shrubs. Sometimes, when I looked from our high window, I saw him riding out to the hunt, his greyhounds running beside him, and his falcon, in his little scarlet hood on his wrist. It was so difficult to realize that he was my father, for he seemed as remote as the strange gods on the painted ceilings, as remote from other men as was the scarlet griffin from the white pigeons that strutted on the parapets. I thought that if only I could see him close, not just a glimpse of him in the distance and hear him talking, it might be that I should find out how I could approach him in some way that would make him understand he must not make my mother so unhappy. I would tell him he must come to see her, for I was sure that when he saw how beautiful she was, he would forget all the grand ladies with their brilliant clothes to whom he seemed so gallant, and remember only that he had loved my mother when he was young, and that they must still love each other when they were old. One day, mother put me to bed very early and told me that it would be a long time before she came up to me, because she must finish the doublet for Orlando to wear at the banquet in honor of the Spanish envoy to Tuscany, who would break his journey to Perugia here on the following night. It was of orange velvet, quilted with gold thread and studded with pearls, and with it he would wear trunk hose with knots of violet ribbon at the knee. I had heard Maria say that Donna Isabella was dining with the women in her own apartments, and that, with my father, would be only the men he had gone hawking with that morning. Suddenly I remembered that behind the tapestry in the banqueting hall there was a niche, which must have been made to hold a statue. It was a deep niche. Sometimes I had hidden there when I was playing at being a beautiful princess, hiding from the robbers in the forest, and it was not too dark, because there was a little tear in the fabric, which let in a ray of light. I was glad it was not a hot night. I was glad it was a hot night, for my clothes were in the lower room, and I only had on a bedshift of white cambric. The door creaked as I opened it and expected to hear mother call out to me. I listened and heard her walk across the room to the cabinet where the jewels were kept, and then the scrape of a stool on the stone floor as she went and sat down again by the window. I hid in a little used anteroom until the banqueting hall was empty of servants, and then I managed to climb up into the niche without anyone seeing me. The tapestry hung away from the wall, and I had to balance myself very carefully on the ledge of the niche, because there was nothing to hold on to when I leaned forward to look through the tear. It seemed a very long time before the servants took up their places behind each chair. Even Gervais, in spite of his pockmarks, looked quite handsome in the household livery of white and scarlet. I could see the chair where my father would sit, a high-backed chair, more like a throne, the arms richly gilded, and the scarlet griffin blazoned on the Spanish leather. I heard voices, and my father came in with his hand on the shoulder of one of his companions. There was a heavy seal ring on his little finger. I had seen the same ring in the painting in the long gallery, the griffin not cut into the stone but in high relief. He was dressed in white and yellow, and wore a gold chain set with emeralds, and a single pear-shaped pearl in his left ear. His little greyhound sat beside him in the great chair and shared the food from his plate. It was an arrogant little dog and snarled at the two boarhounds, which I think belonged to the man on my father's left, as they prowled round the table or quarrelled over the food which their master flung to them. The wine flagons and goblets were of gold or silver, some richly enamelled. The crystal bowl of rose water, which the steward carried round between each course for the company to rinse their fingers, was etched with a wreath of jewelled leaves, and the napkin on which they wiped their hands was of white satin with a silver fringe. I could understand very little of what Orlando said, for most of the time he spoke in a foreign language to the man who had come with him from England, which is a land of barbarians that cannot speak our tongue. I began to get very sleepy, but at last the peacock and boar's head, stuffed pike and cook's crumb, lark, pasties and syllabubs were finished, and the servants were dismissed. The wine flagons had been left on the table, and I heard a goblet clatter to the floor, echoed by laughter, which did not stop the snores of the man who had drunk himself to sleep. I suppose I was tired or careless, for leaning too far forward, I lost my balance, and had to clutch at the tapestry to stop myself falling. The boarhounds must have seen it move, and they leapt at it, trying to tear it down, their hackles rigid and growls rumbling up from their throats. I was really frightened and cowered back as far as I could, and I heard cries of, "An assassin!" And then the weight of the dogs pulled the tapestry down from its hooks, and as it fell, it enveloped them, so that they could not get at me. The men had sprung up from the table, and two of the chairs had been overturned. They had drawn their daggers and stood ready to face an attack. For a moment we looked at each other as if I were a statue and they a fresco. There was no sound, except the wine from an overturned flagon dripping on the floor. Then my father began to laugh. "Be seated, my friends. There are 7 of us, and I think we can defend ourselves against one so small." He turned to the Englishman. "James, get hold of your dogs." The foreigner was smiling at me as if he were vastly amused. He shouted at his dogs, who had at last managed to free themselves from their sudden burial, and crept shamefully to his feet. My father came and picked me up and stood me on the table. I realized that I was very cold and I shivered. He looked kindly at me and said, "There's no need to be frightened." I was angry with him for thinking that I shivered because I was afraid, when it was only because I was so cold. So I said, "Why should I be frightened of a lot of men who are frightened of a little girl behind the tapestry, and 2 stupid dogs who don't know the difference between me and a wild boar?" My father frowned, for all the men laughed. Then he began to laugh too. He looked puzzled and asked me, "How did you get here? I've never seen you before." "I came through that door, and that you have never seen me before is no fault of mine." 2 of the men beside me were talking, and one said to the other, "Look at the line of the jaw and the ear. Orlando's are exactly the same. Look at those straight eyebrows and the way she carries her head." My father still looked puzzled and said, "I must have seen you before. You look so familiar." Another of the men laughed, a drunken, stupid sort of laugh. "Look in your own picture gallery, Orlando, then you will see why she looks so familiar." My father said to me, "Who are you? What is your name?" And I answered, "Your daughter, and my name is Carola. I am 6½ years old, in case you have forgotten." He seemed to forget there was anyone else in the room as he said, "You are Olivia's child. I didn't know that she was here anymore. I had forgotten. Didn't you know that she sewed the doublet you're wearing?" "No, I never thought about it." Then one of them cried out, "A toast to the daughter of the Griffin." And a man who was curled and ribboned like a pet spaniel put the hilt of his dagger into my hand, saying, "Signora, you are indeed an assassin. Your beauty has wounded me in the heart, even as your mother wounded Orlando, but not perhaps in his heart." He giggled like a silly kitchen wrench, and my father said angrily, "Quiet, Deccio," as though he was speaking to one of his dogs. But the man called Deccio went on giggling. "You are a belated champion, Orlando. Was I not respectful enough to your bastard? or perhaps you deny her, though her face gives you the lie. Then my father suddenly got very angry and shouted, "Deny her? No. She shall wear the great seal of the griffin that only my line can wear." He took off his ring and held it in the candle flame, but I don't think anyone realized what he was going to do. He put his arm around my shoulder. He was so tall that although I was standing on the table, we were of the same height, and he said, "Carola, I claim you for the griffin. We of the griffin are brave." He pulled down the bed shift from my shoulder and pressed the red-hot seal against my skin. It hurt a lot, but I managed not to flinch. After it was finished, I found myself crying and shaking as if I had a fever. I said, "I'm very sorry, I'm not really a coward. It's only because I'm 6 and I'm very tired." Nobody was laughing anymore, and they looked at me, and they looked as if they wished they were somewhere else, a long way away. My father picked up his short cloak, which was lying on a chair, and wrapping me in it, he carried me out of the room. It was very dark on the turret stairs, for the moon had not risen. There was a crack of light under the door of our room, so I knew that Mother was still working. She must have been startled at the sound of anyone coming up the stairs so late, because when my father opened the door, she was standing with pearls and a tangle of embroidery threads spilled on the orange velvet at her feet, where they had fallen when she sprang up. Perhaps it is in the nature of all children to think that their parents are old, for it was only when I saw her standing there, with her loosely braided hair hanging to her waist and her eyes heavy with sleep like a tired child, that I realized how young she was. They stood looking at each other. Then he said, "Olivia," and she held out her hands uncertainly towards him, as if she were a vision that might vanish, or she were in a dream from which she was afraid of waking. And then he said very gently, "Come up and help me to put our daughter to bed." He tucked the covers around me, just as if he were an ordinary father who lived with his family and puts his children to bed every night. He asked me whether my mother sang to me as she had sung to him when they were young, and whether she still played on her lute. I was very tired, but before I went to sleep I remember seeing her sitting on the windowsill. It must have been much later, for the moon was very bright, and my father on a cushion at her feet, looking up at her, as she had hoped to see him when he rode past our turret on his return from England. I remember her face, very pale against the dark sky, and how I thought that the nightingales must have flown away, because there was no sound until she sang an old love song to him in a high, clear voice like a bird singing in a tall tree. Right, this is the end of this chapter, which was called The Tear in the Tapestry. The next one is entitled Serene Interlude. Bye-bye.